This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging markets continue to be weighed down by uncertainty over the U.S. election and, of course, surging COVID-19 cases in Europe and the U.S. South Africa's JSE plunged 3% today as the finance minister presented the medium-term budget to Parliament. Now, Treasury did announce that the economy is expected to contract 7.8% this year. And analysts say today's fall may be a sign that investors are not confident in those solutions presented to right the country's precarious situation. Now, in Nigeria, the FMCGs topped the gainers chart. Nestle climbed a whopping 10%. Also, we saw market heavyweight Dangote Cement topping the gainers list, climbing over 2% on the day. Now, also coming up on today's show, Nigeria's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala receives yet another crucial endorsement for the World Trade Organization top job. London's Heathrow Airport is no longer Europe's busiest airport. And Kenyans in the slums adopt what is called the small economy to put food on the table. Well, we start off the bulletin tonight with the World Trade Organization. Nigeria's former finance minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has received a key endorsement from the World Trade Organization Selection Committee. This moves her a step closer to becoming the organization's first female director general. Now, Okonjo-Iweala reportedly has a wide margin of support and is considered the best poised to command a consensus from the organization's 164 members. The Nigerian candidate has served twice as the country's finance minister and has vast experience working as a former managing director of the World Bank and as a chair at the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Well, let's move on now to South Africa. The country's finance minister, Tito Mboweni, has warned against a spiraling debt problem. The minister tabled the country's medium-term budget in Parliament today. Now, debt levels are expected to rise to 95% of GDP over the next 5 years. Mboweni also gave some detail on a plan to bring that debt under control. He also announced new budget allocations to government departments, which included further funding for the cash-strapped South African Airways. Here's Sumitra Naidu with the details.
The finance minister tried to balance out the fragile fiscus. He called on South Africans to help rebuild the economy as they did in 1994. But he warned that debt will spiral out of control if urgent action is not taken.
The economy now is expected to contract by 7.8% this year. And the 2021 outlook is more uncertain. Job losses have been particularly severe. But we cannot allow ourselves to fall into a season of despair, despite the challenges of the pandemic. We cannot allow ourselves to move towards a sovereign debt crisis.
The minister tabled a 5-year fiscal consolidation pathway to promote economic growth. He said there would be a wage freeze for all public workers. Currently, government's wage bill is around $187 million. Ailing state-owned entity SAA also received a budget allocation.
10.5 billion rand is allocated to SAA to implement its business rescue plan. This allocation is funded through reductions to the baselines of national departments, public entities, and conditional grants. This allocation is in addition to the 16.4 billion rand allocated over the 2020 MTF in the February budget for settling guaranteed debt and interest.
Social funding was raised. The minister noted that it was imperative to take care of poor and vulnerable South Africans. More money will go towards job creation and employment opportunities, but several government plans in this regard have failed. Many are keen to see how this money will be spent.
One would have expected that a lot more would have been given by way of saying, okay, guys, we're saying we'll create 800,000 jobs. This is how we think we'll achieve that. This project here will employ 20,000. This one will employ 50. This one will employ this much. And this is how we're going to spend the 100 billion rands.
It'll take us many, many years to recover to where we were at the end of 2019, which wasn't a great place in the first place. We have an increasing population, and GDP has to rise by significantly more than that to really move people's incomes.
The markets fell sharply, but that was on the back of international news. The rand weakened slightly. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's get some more insight into today's speech. We're joined by economist Chris Hart. He is in Johannesburg. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Hart. Now, the question is, does today's budget speech restore any faith in the government's ability to stabilize South Africa's economy? Does it inspire any renewed hope for an economic rebound anytime soon? What exactly stood out for you?
Well, I think what stood out most is that government is really devising a very government-centric approach to recovering from the crisis, and government has so far had a very poor record. It is almost bypassing the private sector, and so it does seem to be that they're consolidating control of the economy around itself. What strikes me is that we've seen these stories before, that debt will peak at 50% of GDP in 2 years' time and then decline. And then the next year, debt will peak at 54% and then decline. And the following year, debt will peak at 60% and then decline. So we're really seeing this, and now debt obviously has really shot up quite a bit. And the problem that the government now faces is that the actual funding plans are in a bit of disarray. The Reserve Bank has obviously got interest rates down at very low levels, the repo rate at 3.5%, but at the longer end of the yield curve, 15, 20 years out, you can't fund below double digits. And that is a problem with government. It means that they've got to increasingly, to get cheaper funding, they have to come shorten their duration to get funding, which means it becomes increasingly difficult to actually fund projects that are of a long-term nature, let's say like road building and infrastructure building, which usually is a long timeline type of investment. The other thing is that it's not clear, with the government becoming increasingly involved in the economy, we're really shifting resources from a capable private sector to a less capable government sector, which of course reduces the multipliers in the economy, and it also has a crowding out effect. To get the economy going, we need investment, and to get investment, South Africa really has to put itself in a more competitive position. And basically, we're trying to put out fires with this medium-term budget, rather than saying, this is how we're going to actually reposition South Africa to be a highly competitive nation, or at least comparable. We've got very, very high tax rates, for instance, and the regulatory burden is exceptionally high. It's an additional tax, if you like, that is placed on business. And then, of course, very, very high corruption levels means that the trust level is low, and investors need to be able to invest in a trust environment. So South Africa is battling just to keep its existing investment onshore, let alone try and attract additional investment. And that's going to be the crux. If we cannot attract additional investment, we're going to actually continue to struggle. We cannot, for instance, we're not really dealing with the COVID epidemic very well. We should have lifted the lockdown by now and being allowed foreign travel. We need that for our tourist sector. It's one of the critical employment sectors. We lost 2.2 million of jobs officially in the second quarter. If we don't actually lift the lid on the economy, that 2.2 million jobs will become permanent, and right, we will see further job losses in an economy that's already struggling.
Now, quite interesting. You mentioned this budget is about putting out fires. And one thing Mboweni mentioned is that the focus this time around will be on reducing spending. A bulk of that will be from the state wage bill through, of course, a pay freeze for this year and the next 3 years. Is this a smart decision, especially given the possible public backlash and economic implications, like you mentioned, further job losses?
Well, it's going to be a backlash from the civil service. Now, remember in the lockdown, the civil servants, not a single civil servant lost their job, and not a single civil servant lost their salary. The brunt of this, of the actual lockdown pressure has really come in the private sector, where businesses were shut down, and of course that's where the job losses came in. So we've seen enormous pain in the one sector and none in the other. And this, in a sense, is one signal to say that that pain, because of now what we see is a shrinking tax base and falling tax take out of the economy, that will impact on the government's ability to sustain its wage bill, which was already unsustainable before the lockdown. And so that has to have a reckoning. But we've seen resolute announcements like this before, only to see the government capitulate later on when it comes to the actual negotiations. And blanket freezes in wages is also possibly not useful, because if you want to improve the capability of the government sector, one will have to actually be able to attract skills, that can actually help improve the capacity and capability of the public sector. And a wage freeze is not exactly an enticing environment to attract those skills.
Now, another area is, ironically, contrary to Finance Minister Mboweni's personal statements in the past, he has allocated about $641 million for South African Airlines. That will, of course, help them implement that rescue plan. They will essentially be taking that money from other government departments going forward. How do South Africans feel about this?
It's, as I say, it's what you call, how's that the money for South African Airways funded? It's through smoke and mirrors. So that's basically how it's funded. Ultimately, it comes from the taxpayer, whether you're actually shifting the deck chairs on the proverbial Titanic is really a moot point. It's got to come from taxpayers, which is a diminishing resource in the economy. We're reducing the tax base through exporting it. That's because we've got an uncompetitive environment for our top taxpayers. So we're seeing a lot of top-end immigration, and of course the job losses have also eroded the tax base quite a bit. So ultimately it gets added to the debt that South Africa is carrying, and it actually pushes us closer to that point where debt may become unsustainable, and sovereign debt crisis is a possibility, and it becomes a stronger possibility. So I think the South African Airways is interesting. There was nothing allocated to things like the SABC and Denel and that, but for those organizations to function, they will need another injection because they're not operating sustainably at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there, and I suspect in the budget in February there's going to be an allocation to those parastatals as well.
And of course, the government said the probability of a debt trap has increased going forward. So what are your thoughts on their financing plan? They said they'll rely on borrowing from multilateral institutions and also draw on sterilization deposits, which it holds with South Africa's Reserve Bank. What are your thoughts on that plan?
Well, what's happening is that up until the beginning of this year, South Africa government largely funded themselves from internal resources. Pension funds would buy government debt as an anchor to their portfolio. They've never had a problem in financing, but now we're seeing the yield curve steepen, which means that there's an increasing reluctance to lend to the government on a longer term basis. And the government has now started to look to international sources. And that is also a big warning bell, because the South African government doesn't have any means to actually service foreign debt. They can service local debt even if it's by printing money, but servicing foreign debt, they don't have a means of earning that foreign exchange to service that debt. And so they have to actually apportion it from the private sector, and that's where we start to really hurtle towards a sovereign debt crisis. Sovereign debt crisis don't start off from domestic issued debt. It's the international foreign currency denominated debt that actually precipitates these crises, and effectively we're going to see the government start to impose on the private sector to get the needed foreign exchange to service their debt at the expense of imports and particularly exports. That will come those are some of the manifestations we'll see as we head towards a debt crisis. We will head towards a debt crisis if we don't get growth going, and we will not get growth going if we cannot attract investment. And those are the factors. We have to also boost savings in the economy, because the savings are the fundamental resource to actually fund investment within the economy. Those issues were not addressed, but at all, and those are critical fundamentals that are absent.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hart, for your insight into today's budget speech. That is Chris Hart. He's an economist joining us there from Johannesburg. Well, let's turn our attention now to Zimbabwe. The country is clawing back ground on inflation, which had soared to a 10-year high of 837% in July. Now, authorities now expect it to end the year at 134%. That is more than halving the central bank's previous forecast. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe had previously forecast 2020 annual inflation at 300%. From Harare, here's CGTN's Farai Mwakutuya with the details.
The rate at which prices of goods have been going up has slowed down in recent months, bringing relief to hard-pressed shoppers, but also emboldening Treasury officials, who had initially projected annual inflation to come down to 300% by year end, but have now halved that forecast. Monthly inflation is expected to perform even better.
The month-on-month figures are the ones that matter. And I think by then we might see single-digit inflation month by month, which will mean that we are really making a lot of headway compared to the figures of 70-80% month-on-month, sometimes 600-700% year-on-year. Those sort of figures are now coming down to much more reasonable figures. But even 3 or 4% a month is a high rate of inflation. What we want is 3 or 4% a year. And so we've got some way to go to get there, but I think we might do it in 2021.
Stability has been brought by a weekly foreign currency auction that has improved availability of hard currency at the official exchange rate. There's still a mismatch between the demand for and supply of foreign currency, which manifests itself in continued activity, albeit subdued, on the black market. Getting adequate foreign currency requires rebuilding productive capacity.
That means we need investors, and that means we need investment policies that are attractive to investors. Right now, the investors around the world comparing the conditions and the regulations and the restrictions and the licenses that we demand in Zimbabwe, they're saying it's easier to start a business somewhere else.
Over the last 2 years, Zimbabwe has stepped up reforms to improve the ease of doing business and to attract foreign capital. Government has also been keeping a tight leash on expenditures, including resisting unsustainable wage increases that could cause inflation to rise again. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, let's now take a look at our corporate headlines today. Kenya's largest lender by assets, KCB Group, has been voted the safest bank in the country by the Global Finance Rankings. The lender was also ranked at position 667 globally in the banker's top 1,000 World Bank's ranking for 2020. It climbed 40 places in the survey that shows a stabilization in finances of the majority of African lenders. Meanwhile, French oil giant Total and its partners have made a second gas condensate find off the southern coast of South Africa. The discovery comes after Total announced the opening of a new world-class oil and gas province off South Africa. And U.S. plane manufacturer Boeing has announced plans to trim its workforce by about 7,000 amidst the global COVID-19 pandemic. The company, which had previously announced deep cuts, says its staff will drop to just 130,000 by end of next year. This is a 20% drop from the 160,000 it employed back in April. And German automaker Mercedes-Benz is set to raise its stake in Aston Martin Lagonda to 20%. This is part of efforts to initiate economic recovery amidst the coronavirus pandemic. The deal will give Aston Martin access to Mercedes electric car technology. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's now head into a short break, still to come. Africa's financial markets show improved resilience in spite of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Lagos business activity slowly returned to normal following last week's SARS protests.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sudan. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. Now, Africa's financial markets have certainly been tested by the pandemic, but the 2020 edition of the ABSA Financial Markets Index shows improved resilience across board. Now, the index revealed that financial markets in Africa are proving to be robust, with countries such as South Africa and Mauritius leading the way. The countries whose standing improved the most from last year are Ghana, Morocco, and Seychelles. Now, stronger legal frameworks and growing local investor capacity contributed to better scores overall. They concluded that the expansion and innovation that have taken place in recent years will certainly help in Africa's rebound and recovery process. Now, the index saw only 6 out of 17 countries score above 50 back in 2017, with many performing poorly in more than 40 indicators considered. Well, this year, 14 out of 23 countries scored above 50, and that indicates improvements across the board. The index is independently produced by the official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, and it serves as a guide for governments to put the necessary infrastructure in place to deepen and improve their markets. Well, earlier I spoke to ABSA's head of regional markets, George Asante, and we kicked off the conversation with the impact of COVID-19, the impact that COVID-19 has had on Africa's financial systems.
I think one of the key things to recognize is that the financial markets in Africa have not been insulated from the impact of COVID. We've actually seen that liquidity across the various markets on the continent has actually been impacted to some degree as the pandemic hit, and particularly as we saw a lot of exits by investors outside different countries who had invested money in, who were under pressure to actually take money back home. So to that extent, we actually saw the markets have seen some impact. If you want to put it in context of the index pillar on market depth actually saw a decline. So overall, there is a decline of about 0.6 percentage points across board, which is a reflection of the fact that the market liquidity had thinned, mainly driven by events around the pandemic.
Well, according to the index, you saw 14 out of 23 nations scoring above 50 this year, which you say is a huge improvement in the last 4 years across board. What exactly spurred this improvement, Mr. Asante? Growing local capacity, or is it improving international and cross-border activity? And suddenly, which nations stood out this year?
It's basically recognizing the fact that if you had just about 6 of the countries being surveyed, showing up with scores of more than 50% about 4 years ago compared to this year where there were about 14, as you rightly said, that is a significant statement in terms of the fact that the markets have become deeper, the markets have become more broad-based, the markets have become more resilient. And as you pointed out, I think one of the key things that have happened on the continent has been the growing capacity of local investors. So due to some of the regulatory reforms that have been done around pension funds management, around asset management sector within the various economies, we're actually seeing that local investors are becoming stronger and stronger and are playing the key role of serving as the shock absorbers when there are crises. The other important thing to note is that across the continent over the period, what we are seeing is a migration from a pegged regime for currency to more floating regimes of currency. And that is also quite important because it ensures that asset prices on the financial market reflect true values, intrinsic or otherwise, of the assets. And that has been an important thing developing across the continent, which is leading to improvement in the overall financial market. Specific countries that need noting are countries like Nigeria, where the currency used to be more or less strictly managed, but gradually is moving towards a floating regime through the INE window that has just been launched on the FMDQ platform in Nigeria. Other current countries like Angola are also becoming more relaxed when it comes to exchange controls, leading to improvement. Countries like Namibia passed policies to ensure that more of its investable funds, long dated in particular, are actually retained in country to drive infrastructure growth and also activity on the Namibian stock market. So these are some countries that have really done significant things. Of course, you cannot go without talking about South Africa, which continues to blaze the trail on the continent, and Mauritius, that have also put in very systemic kind of reforms to ensure that the financial market play the critical role of serving as a match place between people who have money and people who need money for good things. So that match can happen, and then the good things, which is infrastructure development, can also happen. So I think all it's been quite rewarding to see, and we really look forward to the future of the financial market with some of these developments coming on stream.
That was George Asante there, the head of APSA's regional markets. Well, let's shift our focus now to South Sudan. The country's government says it is working to salvage its economy. It has also called for further international assistance. Now, a fall in global oil prices and a long-lasting civil war triggered inflation, pushing prices of basic goods beyond the reach of many in the East African nation.
I would want to reassure you that the government is fully committed to work with all the stakeholders to implement the revitalized peace agreement, because we are all determined to have a permanent stability and prosperity in our country.
The collapse in oil prices has resulted in the widening budget deficit that has been explained. The government's capacity to deliver peace dividends that may indeed put at risk the revitalized agreement on the resolution of conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. And this is of enormous concern to all of us as your partners.
Our hope as development partners is to see the Republic of South Sudan investing in its service sector, particularly in delivering health and education, which are held up not just by in terms of international norms, but also in the peace process.
Meanwhile, in Nigeria's commercial city of Lagos, economic activities are gradually returning to normal. This, of course, follows last week's SARS protests that led to shutdowns and a curfew in 4 states. The majority of business owners have taken advantage of the relative calm to resume operations, but others are still counting their losses following the prolonged unrest that disrupted movement of goods and services. Here is CGTN's Deji Badmus with an update on that situation.
It's the first day this massive shopping mall in the heart of Lagos would be reopening after the violence that hit the city. But shop owners here are returning to virtually empty shops. All 150 shops in the Adeniro Ogunsanya Mall, the Surulere axis of Lagos, were completely looted. This shop sells clothes, but all the clothes are now gone. It's the same story for this perfume shop. Everything looted. And wait for this one, the liaison office of a university.
They broke into our shops, took accessories, printing press machines, they took computers, televisions. They also took so many things, so many effects that really affected us. Like they took close to over 10 million in worth what they've taken from the office.
Most of the capital here is from hedge funds, from venture capital, from banks, from finance companies, and loan raised from family and other individuals. It's a trading cycle here. You only live off of the commission. So I empathize with them. It is not easy to experience black economy. It was white economy before, but right now it's black economy for them.
For now, no trading is going on at the mall as the traders continue to take stock of their loss. It would certainly be a while before this place comes back to what it once was.
These people actually need help. As soon as those helps comes, then some of them that has insurance those ones can access their insurance claim and then start business. But for those who are without insurance, certainly government will have to, one way or the other, assist them, because the earlier they come back, the earlier we're able to create jobs and we're able to restart the economy.
The Lagos state government has committed to assist those whose shops were looted in the violence. How quickly the government is able to mobilize the funds and get them to the traders will to some extent determine how quickly some of the looted shops in this shopping mall resume operations. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
You are watching Global Business Africa. We're going to take a short break now. Still to come on the show. London's Heathrow Airport is no longer Europe's busiest airport. And Singapore's aviation staff try new skills to make ends meet.
It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's now recap today's top headlines. The world has seen 2.8 million new COVID-19 cases in the past week. The World Health Organization reports that the highest jump so far in a 7-day period. Now, Europe saw the most, with over 1.3 million infections. This accounts for nearly half of all cases worldwide. South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia saw the highest numbers in Africa, but the continent only accounted for 1% of those new cases. Meanwhile, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has begun a period of self-quarantine. That's after possibly being exposed to COVID-19. This happened during a dinner that Ramaphosa attended for the Adopt a School Foundation, which is a partner entity of the Cyril Ramaphosa Foundation. A statement from the presidency says that he is not showing any symptoms and will be tested if need be. Now, Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune has been hospitalized. This comes days after he went into self-isolation after positive coronavirus cases amongst his aides. It has not yet been confirmed by his office what the cause of his illness is. However, the presidency says that his condition is stable and did not warrant any concern and that he was still working. And that is a look at our top headlines. Well, let's get you some international news. London's Heathrow is no longer Europe's busiest airport. Paris rival Charles de Gaulle has now taken that spot. This is a huge blow to Britain's global trade ambitions, as the country's current relationship with the European Union is due to end in 2 months' time. The downgrade is as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and the British government's inaction for plunging passengers' numbers. Now, those numbers at Heathrow are down about 84% in the 3 months ending September, pushing it to a 1.95 billion loss over the first 9 months of this year. Now, Heathrow has criticized the UK government for being slow to introduce an airport testing regime to replace 14-day quarantine rules, saying the delays were now causing additional economic harm.
They've got a difficult job to do, but increasingly we are seeing that this is not just about a health pandemic, it's also a jobs pandemic. And unless we take action to protect the economy, then we are going to be losing millions of jobs here in the UK, many of which rely on aviation. And of course, it's not just jobs at airlines and airports and companies like Rolls-Royce. It's also about all the businesses that rely on exports, that rely on the supply chain that comes in on planes. They rely on our services sector and tourism and education. Now, this is a vital part of the UK economy. And other countries are moving ahead with testing.
Now, battered by the impact of COVID-19, the airline industry is struggling to pay its staff. Some are even cutting jobs now. As a result, many of the affected have been forced to take their skills elsewhere. Here is Miro Liu with the details from Singapore.
Singapore started the year as an international air hub, with its Changi Airport ranked as the 7th busiest airport in the world. Since then, Changi's ranking has dropped to 58 on that list. With international travel completely disrupted and no domestic flights to cushion some of those impacts, Singapore's airline industry is struggling, forcing some of the crew members to look for other employment. A commercial pilot for almost 14 years, Kenny Tay was in the midst of changing employers when the pandemic took the world by surprise. Unable to secure the new job, Kenny turned his passion for grooming cars into a profession.
Well, the whole change in job scope has cut me back about household income of about 70%. So naturally, some things have to go. Well, you have to try to save here and there.
Kenny is not alone. With only a skeletal network in operation, the national carrier Singapore Airlines passenger carriage has declined more than 98% since the pandemic began. The airlines has decided to cut 4,300 jobs through a hiring freeze and retrenchments, as well as early retirement and voluntary release programs. To help weather this storm, airline staff unions and the National Trades Union Congress are working with other industry partners to enroll the affected workers in traineeship programs or place them in new jobs. Several businesses have also come forward to help. One of them is the international education group Eton House, which has offered to hire over 100 Singapore Airlines staff members.
The idea is that we have 2 tracks in this program. The first one is to become a teacher, where there's a place and train program, and there's a second track where you can work in the administration arm.
Fleur Ong is one of the beneficiaries of this program. After almost a decade as a cabin crew member, she decided to switch careers.
With my experience working with people from different countries and cultures, I think it will be beneficial to help me build positive relationships with them.
In its July report, the International Air Transport Association said that global passenger traffic is unlikely to return to normal until 2024. This uncertainty has pushed some of the airline staff to completely change careers. But there are many others like Kenny who are still longing for the day when they can soar to the skies again. Miro Liu, CGTN, Singapore.
Meanwhile, reports say that aircraft engine and luxury car manufacturer Rolls-Royce is preparing to close factories temporarily and cut working hours. It is all part of its current cost-cutting drive to cope with the collapse in aircraft demand. And as Andrew Wilson explains, the UK brand is not alone.
There's a lot at stake here. Rolls-Royce has been making engines as long as planes have taken passengers, and it's an iconic UK brand. The rights issue puts badly needed funding back into the operation in time for the company to tackle next year's debt after posting $6 million losses in the first 2 quarters of 2020. Rolls-Royce is preparing a massive cost-cutting exercise, closing factories and reducing working hours. 9,000 jobs are already in jeopardy, and strike action next month seems unavoidable. But the engine manufacturer is far from alone. Across the globe, airlines and airports are reeling from the effects of coronavirus, pulling the plug on this enormous sector.
Thing that's obviously a problem at the moment is the requirement for quarantine in certain parts of the world. I mean, if you go to the UK at the moment, you're subject to 14 days quarantine, and a lot of people aren't able to afford the time. Till we've got those harmonised, we're not going to see the confidence return to travel, and obviously travel is the absolute key to getting the global economy and to get the social mobility of the entire planet back to levels that I think we'd all like to see.
Low-cost carrier EasyJet has raised nearly $500 million by selling and leasing back part of its fleet. And while the leasing market has been relatively buoyant during the pandemic, EasyJet's aircraft sales are still dwarfed by its losses. For national carriers, engine manufacturers and budget airlines alike, the missing ingredient is passenger confidence and quarantine-free travel. Until people can move unrestricted between borders again, there'll be no V-shaped recovery for this sector. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
Well, the pandemic has also seen a drop in rents across major U.S. cities as people flee urban centers. But some venture capitalists are now raising funds to take on the apartment sharing sector, which they think has a huge potential, especially in New York. Here's CGTN's John Terrett with more.
New York is one of the most romantic places to live. And one of the most romantic songs about New York, one that reminds people why they might one day aspire to live here too, is Manhattan, the 1950s recording by Ella Fitzgerald. In the song, Ella sings, "It's very fancy on Old Delancey Street, and the subway charms us so when balmy breezes blow." Obviously, it's been a while since she was last down here. And Ella sings, "Tell me what street compares with Mott Street in July." Well, happily for CGTN, Mott Street is now in the heart of Chinatown. But you know, New York is a very different place post-COVID-19 to how it once was. For example, there are reports every day of people leaving the city for the suburbs. There are no tourists here, or very few of them. There's no rush hour in the morning and the afternoon at the railway stations. And it is reported apartment rents are dropping fast. But is that true? Are people fleeing the city?
The short answer is yes, particularly during the peak time of COVID. These upwardly mobile people there are a lot of people in the realm of finance or tech, where they have the ability to work remotely. They have the luxury of working remotely, and they have the resources to do it outside of the city.
But despite the gloomy scenario, one company is betting on New York's housing market bouncing back big time. Common designs apartments and manages them once they're built. It recently raised a further $50 million to provide shared accommodation for people earning between $45,000 and $70,000 a year, a group of people who generally have stayed in cities like New York because, unlike higher-paid people, they can't afford to leave.
Co-living is all about affording a nicer place, a nicer apartment in the neighborhood you want to live in at a more affordable, at a lower price point than a studio or one-bedroom apartment in the neighborhood. The people who are moving into co-living, the people who are living with roommates, the pandemic didn't suddenly make them wealthier. They can't suddenly now afford a studio or one-bedroom apartment where they couldn't before. So the people who were living with roommates prior to COVID are still living with roommates today.
The co-living market may have remained relatively stable, but how long before housing in cities like New York picks up again? While chatting to Joseph, I suggested it may be as long as 10 or 20 years.
I don't have a crystal ball. I can't put a timeline on it, but I don't think it'll be that long. We saw how the city emptied out. It was just surreal. But we've seen it start to come back to life, right? With the restaurants and activities. So yeah, I'm very positive about it.
And Brad agrees. The secret sauce, he says, will be a widely available vaccine.
If you look at historical pandemics, cities have bounced back much faster than that. But we're probably going to project at least one leasing cycle. So if a vaccine is readily available next summer, my prediction is that we will see a recovery in the rental markets in 2022.
Let's return to that song by Ella, written by Rogers and Hart, that to this day inspires people to want to live here. How does it go at the end? Oh yeah.
We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy.
A lot of people, it seems, are banking on it. John Terrett, CGTN, New York.
And shifting focus now, let's take a look at commodity markets today. Oil prices went into reverse, giving up some of the previous day's gains. That is as a surge in U.S. crude stocks and rising coronavirus infections in the U.S. and Europe did help to fan those fears of a supply glut and, of course, weaker fuel demand. Gold prices were little changed. They stayed above the $1,900 per ounce mark as uncertainty about U.S. elections countered some pressure from a firmer dollar today and, of course, the fading hope of an immediate U.S. stimulus package. Well, we are going to take a short break now, still coming up on the show. Kenyans in the slums adopt what is called the small economy to put food on the table.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've Tunis, Cairo, Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, in Kenya, the livelihoods of millions of people have been impacted by COVID-19. The situation is even worse in low-income settlements where residents live on less than $1 a day. But as CGTN's Robert Nagila reports, a system which is referred to as the small economy now allows them to put food on their tables.
It's mid-morning in Kibra, Kenya's largest informal settlement. Many of its residents are casual laborers who've lost their jobs as a result of the economic downturn brought about by COVID-19.
About 250,000 people call this home. Most of them live on less than $1 a day. But despite the harsh conditions, the people here have come up with their own unique economy that gets them by.
Deep in the heart of the settlement, Lydia Sunday has come to her local shop for her weekly shopping. But this is not your average shopping trip. Known as the Kadogo economy or small economy, the principle behind it sees retailers selling goods in small quantities for as little as 5 cents.
Things like sugar and oil. The quantity depends on how much you have.
A 2011 World Bank study, however, shows low-income earners end up paying more than middle or even upper-income earners. Once her shopping's complete, she makes her way home through the narrow, muddy alleys in the settlement.
Today I bought flour for ugali and for baking, some vegetables, some soap, paraffin, sugar and bread.
The mother of 3 arrives at her one-room rented house and begins preparing lunch for the children.
I used to cook twice a day because a local school provided lunch for the children in the area. But now that schools are open, they have stopped.
Lunch today is vegetables and ugali made from maize flour and water. Up until March this year, she ran a small business but was forced to shut it because of COVID-19. She now depends on money from her family in the countryside and casual jobs within the settlement. She admits life is much tougher now than it was before the pandemic struck. But she's determined to see this period through for the sake of her children. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, before we leave you today, here's a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand extending losses today as Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered the medium-term budget policy statement. At the start of Mboweni's speech at 2 p.m., the rand had weakened about 0.75%, while by 2:28 p.m., it had weakened a further 1.45%. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira strengthened against the dollar today. It closed at around 460 naira per dollar on the parallel market. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.